snow fell the way memory falls, soft at first, almost kind, until it covered everything that once felt certain. I remember the evening she came into town, though no one said her name aloud then. She moved along the edge of the street, like a thought people were trying not to think, her boots worn thin, her coat too light, for a season that did not forgive weakness. The sky hung low, a pale iron lid, and the wind threaded itself through the wooden buildings as if searching for something it had lost. Clara Whitmore carried a book against her chest, not for reading, but for keeping her hands from trembling. Pride has a way of borrowing small objects to disguise itself. Her eyes moved from door to door, not with hope, but with calculation, the kind a person learns when hope has already failed them once too often. A teacher, they would later say. Proper, educated, alone. Those last two words were the only ones that mattered. The first door she tried opened just enough to let warmth escape. A woman stood there, older, careful. Clara spoke softly, her voice trained to calm restless children, asking for a night's shelter, offering to work, to teach, to clean, anything that could be repaid in dignity. The woman listened, her face caught between sympathy and fear, and then shook her head with the gentlest refusal a person can manage when they are still choosing themselves over kindness. The door closed slowly, as if it wished it had done otherwise. By the second door, the words came harder. By the third, they barely came at all. It does not take long for a town to decide what a person is worth. Mrs. Darlene Crow stood outside the general store with her gloved hands folded neatly, watching as Clara crossed the street. Darlene had a voice that traveled farther than most and a certainty that required no evidence. She leaned toward another woman and whispered something small and sharp, and though Clara could not hear it, she felt it land. Some words do not need sound. They arrive in the way eyes narrow, in the way shoulders turn just slightly away. A woman alone, Darlene murmured, loud enough for the air to carry, rarely brings anything but trouble. It spread from there, not like fire, but like frost, quiet, steady, covering surfaces until nothing underneath could be seen clearly again. The schoolhouse had once been Clara's refuge. She had stood at its front with chalk-dusted fingers and a voice that believed in the future, guiding children through letters and numbers as though they were stepping stones across a river. But winter takes more than warmth. It takes opportunity. Funds had been cut, they said. Attendance had dropped. There were reasons, always reasons. Yet it was the whispers that sealed it. The suggestion that a woman without family must carry some hidden fault, some story best kept at a distance. By dusk, the schoolhouse door was no longer hers to open. She did not cry. That is important to remember. Tears require a certain safety, a belief that someone might witness them and understand. Clara had neither. Instead, she walked to the edge of town, where an abandoned shed leaned into the wind like a tired man. Its boards were split, its roof uncertain, but it offered what the town would not: indifference. Inside, the air was colder than outside, as if the place had forgotten what warmth ever felt like. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall, and drew her knees close, the book still held against her chest like a promise she no longer expected to keep. The wind slipped through the cracks and touched her skin with thin, persistent fingers. Time slowed there, stretching into something fragile and endless. It was in that long, quiet struggle between night and endurance that his words returned to her. He had not spoken them with charm, nor with any intention to persuade. Elias Boone was not a man who shaped language for effect. He had stood near the hitching post earlier that afternoon, snow gathering on the brim of his hat, watching the street with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have already seen too much. When Clara passed him, he had studied her not with curiosity, but with recognition. "I need a loving mother for my sons," he had said, as if stating the weather. "And you need shelter." No softness wrapped the offer. No apology softened its edges. It was not a proposal, it was an equation, something practical, something honest in a way that felt almost cruel. Clara had turned to him then, her spine straightening despite the cold, her dignity rising like a last defense. "I am not a thing to be traded," she had replied, her voice steady, though it trembled somewhere beneath the surface. Elias had not argued. He had simply nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth that did not change the facts before him. "No," he said quietly, But you are a woman who needs a place to stay, and I am a man who cannot raise two boys alone." There had been no insult in his tone, no pity either, only a strange, unyielding clarity. She had walked away from him then, carrying both the weight of his words and the sharp sting of them. Pride had kept her moving. Pride had kept her silent. Pride had brought her to this empty shed, where the night pressed in and the cold began to speak more loudly than anything he had said. It is a difficult thing, choosing between dignity and survival. People like to believe they would never make such a choice, that they would endure rather than bend. But winter has a way of rewriting those beliefs, stripping them down until only the body remains, and the body has its own kind of wisdom. By morning, the world had not softened. The snow lay thicker, the sky no kinder. Clara rose slowly, her limbs stiff, her breath shallow from the night's cold. For a moment, she stood still, as if listening for something, a sign, perhaps, that another path might reveal itself. None came. When she stepped back into town, the streets were quieter, the judgment no less present for being unspoken. She did not look at the doors this time. She did not seek them. Instead, she walked with a kind of calm that can only be mistaken for strength by those who have never felt it, a calm born not from certainty, but from the absence of options. Elias Boone was where she expected him to be, near the general store, his horse tied loosely, his posture unchanged from the day before. Snow had settled along his shoulders, and he had not bothered to brush it away. He looked at her as she approached, not surprised, not triumphant, simply present. Clara stopped a few steps away. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of pine and cold iron. "I will come," she said at last. The words were simple, stripped of ornament, but they carried more weight than any speech could have held. They were not an acceptance of him, nor of his life. They were an acceptance of necessity. Elias inclined his head, a gesture of respect rather than victory. "You'll have a room," he replied, "and food. The rest will figure as we go." He did not thank her. She did not ask him to. The ride to the ranch stretched long and quiet, the town fading behind them until it seemed less like a place and more like a judgment she had stepped out from under. The land opened wide, white and endless, broken only by the dark lines of fences and the distant silhouettes of trees. The sky felt larger there, though no warmer. Clara sat stiffly in the saddle, her hands gripping the reins more out of habit than necessity. She did not speak, and neither did Elias. It was not an uncomfortable silence, exactly, but it was not easy either. It was the kind of silence that waits, patient and watchful, for something to grow within it. The ranch house appeared slowly, emerging from the snow like a memory returning piece by piece. It was larger than she had expected, though worn at the edges, its paint faded, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of winter's past. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin but steady, a sign of life, if not of warmth. Two figures stood near the doorway as they approached. The older boy, Samuel, held himself with a guarded stillness that mirrored his father's, though his eyes burned with something sharper, suspicion, perhaps, or the early formation of resentment. He watched Clara as though she were an answer to a question he had not agreed to ask. The younger one, Noah, stood half a step behind him, his face softer, his gaze uncertain but curious. There was a quiet longing in him, the kind that does not yet know how to protect itself. "This is Miss Whitmore," Elias said, his voice even. "She'll be staying with us." He offered no explanation beyond that, no justification. The statement hung in the cold air, waiting to be accepted or rejected. Sam did neither. He simply nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged her presence without welcoming it. Noah's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, searching for something, kindness, perhaps, or reassurance. Clara inclined her head slightly, her posture composed despite the unease settling around her. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice gentle, measured. Noah murmured a reply. Sam remained silent. Inside, the house held a different kind of cold, not the sharp bite of winter, but the quiet absence of warmth that lingers long after loss. The rooms were orderly, functional, but untouched by softness. No laughter seemed to have lived there recently, no lingering traces of comfort. Elias showed her to a small room at the end of the hallway. "It's not much," he said, though there was no apology in his tone, only fact. "It's enough," Clara replied, and for the first time since the snow had begun to fall, that was true. As the door closed behind her, she stood alone in the unfamiliar space, her book still in her hands, her breath steadying. Outside, the wind moved across the land, relentless and unchanged. But within those walls, something had shifted, small, fragile, not yet trust, not yet belonging, but something that might, if given time, become both. And that, perhaps, is how all beginnings truly arrive, not with certainty, but with the quiet courage to remain. Morning settled over the ranch like a careful hand, pale light filtering through frost-laced windows, touching each surface without quite warming it. Clara rose before the others, not out of habit alone, but from a quiet need to prove, though no one had asked, that her presence carried weight. She moved through the kitchen with deliberate gentleness, coaxing life into the stove, measuring flour and water with the same precision she once used to guide children through their lessons. Every action felt observed, even in solitude. When the boys entered, the air shifted. Noah paused at the threshold, drawn first by the scent of something warm, something unfamiliar in its tenderness. Sam followed more slowly, his gaze sweeping the room as if searching for changes he had not agreed to accept. He noticed the table set with care, the bread cut evenly, the cups placed not by habit but by intention. Clara did not look up immediately. She allowed them the space to arrive, to decide for themselves what this moment meant. "Sit," she said softly, not as a command, but as an offering. Noah obeyed. Sam hesitated, then took his place with a stiffness that spoke of resistance rather than hunger. Elias entered last, his boots carrying the cold with him, his eyes resting briefly on Clara before moving to the table. He said nothing, yet something in his stillness suggested acknowledgement. They ate in near silence, but silence, when shared, is not always empty. It carries small shifts, Noah reaching for another piece of bread, Sam glancing once, then quickly away, Elias slowing his movements as though listening to something unspoken. Clara did not force conversation. She understood that trust, like winter ground, does not soften under pressure. It yields only to time. Days passed in this careful rhythm. Clara found her place not by claiming it, but by tending to what had been neglected. She mended worn sleeves, her needle moving steadily as though stitching more than fabric. She organized the scattered books she discovered in a dusty corner, the pages brittle but intact, and placed them where light could reach them again. She spoke to Noah in quiet moments, guiding him through simple words, watching his face brighten with each small success. Sam remained distant. He observed her with a vigilance that did not waver, as though waiting for some hidden truth to reveal itself. He answered her only when necessary, his tone measured, controlled. Yet even in his resistance, there was attention, and attention, whether given in kindness or doubt, is its own form of connection. Elias watched it all with the patience of a man who had learned that forcing change often breaks it. One afternoon, Clara accompanied him into town. The sky hung low again, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the streets bore the familiar weight of judgment. Conversation softened as they passed. Eyes lingered longer than politeness allowed. Clara felt it before she heard it, the subtle tightening of the air, the shift in posture, the quiet alignment of unspoken agreement. Mrs. Darlene Crow stood near the store, her presence as immovable as ever. She regarded Clara with a thin smile that carried no warmth. "So it's true, then," Darlene said, her voice carrying just enough to reach those who pretended not to listen. "You found yourself a place. Convenient. How quickly some women recover." Clara held her gaze, not with defiance, but with a calm that refused to bend. "I have work," she replied simply. Darlene's smile sharpened. "Is that what we're calling it?" The words hung in the air, heavier than the falling snow. Elias stepped forward then, not with anger, but with a quiet finality. "We're calling it enough," he said, his tone even, leaving no room for further comment. Darlene said nothing more, but her silence carried its own verdict. On the ride back, Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, though the land offered little to focus on beyond its endless white. Shame does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in small, persistent ways, finding its place in the spaces between breaths. "I won't stay where I'm not wanted," she said at last, her voice steady, though softer than before. Elias did not turn to look at her. "You're not there," he replied. "That town is part of your life. It doesn't decide it." His words were simple, but they did not dismiss her pain. They merely refused to let it define what stood before them. At the ranch, the tension followed them inside. Sam had heard enough. He stood near the doorway, his posture rigid, his expression set in a way that made him seem older than he was. "They're right," he said, his voice cutting through the room with a clarity that surprised even him. "You're not our mother." The words landed without cruelty, but without mercy either. Noah flinched. Elias remained still. Clara felt the weight of them, not as an attack, but as a truth that had been waiting to be spoken. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. Instead, she met Sam's gaze with a quiet understanding that did not seek to correct him. "I know," she said. The simplicity of her response unsettled him more than any denial could have. That night, she packed her things. There were not many. Her book, a few mended garments, the small pieces of herself she had carried from place to place. She moved with the same care she had shown in staying, each motion deliberate, respectful, as though acknowledging that this, too, was part of the arrangement. Elias found her near the door. "You're leaving," he said, though it was not a question. "I should have sooner," she replied, "before I forgot what this was." "And what is it?" "A place I was allowed to borrow." The words were not bitter. They were clear. Elias stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, filled with everything neither had yet said. Then, slowly, he spoke. "This house hasn't been warm since their mother died," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Not in a way that mattered, until you came." Clara's hand tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. "I didn't ask you to replace anything," he continued, "only to be here. And you have been more than that." She looked at him then, truly looked, seeing not the steadiness he showed the world, but the wear beneath it, the careful restraint of a man who had learned to carry absence as though it were permanent. "I don't belong here," she said, though the certainty in her voice had softened. "Neither do I," he replied, "not the way I used to." The truth of that settled between them, quiet and undeniable. Before either could speak further, a sound broke through the stillness. "Noah." It was not loud, not at first, a faint call, strained and uncertain, but it carried urgency, the kind that demands attention before understanding. Clara moved before thought could follow. She found him in his bed, his face flushed, his breath uneven, his small frame trembling beneath the blankets. Fever had taken hold, swift and unforgiving, his body caught in a struggle it did not know how to win. Elias was at her side in an instant. "He was fine this morning," he said, though the words felt insufficient against what they faced now. "Winter doesn't ask permission," Clara murmured, her hand already at Noah's forehead, her touch steady despite the rising tension within her. "We need to keep him warm, and we'll need medicine." "I'll ride to town," Elias said. "The storm." "I'll ride." There was no hesitation in him, no weighing of risk, only decision. As he left, the wind rose, as if in answer, carrying snow across the land in thick, relentless waves. The door closed behind him, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Clara stayed with Noah through the long hours that followed. She cooled his skin with damp cloths, whispered quiet reassurances he may not have heard, and refused to let fatigue claim her. Sam lingered at the doorway at first, his presence uncertain, his expression caught between fear and something he could not yet name. "Will he be all right?" he asked finally. Clara did not offer false certainty. "He's strong," she said, "but he needs us." Us. The words settled into the room, unfamiliar, yet not unwelcome. Sam stepped closer. He watched as she worked, as she gave without expectation, as she remained when leaving would have been easier, simpler, justified. Something in him shifted, not suddenly, not completely, but enough to loosen the grip of his doubt. Hours passed. The storm outside raged. indifferent to the fragile battle within those walls. Clara's strength wavered, then steadied again. She did not count the time, only the breaths, only the moments Noah remained with them. When Elias returned, the night had deepened. Snow clung to him, his movements slowed by exhaustion, but his eyes searched the room with a focus that cut through everything else. He placed the medicine in Clara's hands without a word. Their fingers brushed, just briefly. It was not a gesture meant to comfort, yet it did. Together, they brought Noah through the worst of it. By morning, the fever had broken. The change was subtle at first, a steadier breath, a softness returning to his features. But it was enough. Enough to ease the tension that had held them through the night. Enough to allow the smallest measure of relief. Clara sat beside the bed, her posture finally yielding to exhaustion, her eyes closing for a moment longer than she intended. When she opened them, Sam was there. He stood quietly, his usual defenses lowered, his expression uncertain, but no longer guarded. He hesitated, then moved closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had resisted. Clara met his gaze, not with triumph, but with understanding. "You were protecting what mattered to you," she replied. He nodded, though he did not fully trust his voice again. Instead, he sat beside her, close enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier. Elias watched from the doorway. There was no need for words. What had been fragile now held something steadier, not yet unbreakable, but real. Later, when Clara stood once more in her small room, her bag still packed, where she had left it, she did not reach for it. Instead, she set it aside, not because she needed shelter, but because, somewhere between the storm and the quiet that followed, she had found something that asked her to stay. And this time, she chose it freely. Outside, the snow began to ease, the sky shifting almost imperceptibly, as though making room for a season not yet visible, but already on its way. And in that quiet turning, a house that had long forgotten how to hold warmth began, at last, to remember.